Welcome to the fifth installment of Theory Chats, an interactive companion to the 2024 book, The Theory Story Reader for Social Studies, published with Teachers College Press. We hope this abbreviated conversation and the ones that are to follow will pique people's interest about how the book approaches, stories, and applies theory to social studies education. If it happens to do so, the volume is available at all major online retailers or by going directly to tcpress.com and searching for the title. Aaron and I are also more than happy to answer any questions related to the project, so please reach out. We'd love to hear from you. Today's guest is Dr. Ryan Oto, who will be talking about pedagogy of solidarity and youth enterprise, which is highlighted in his chapter.
Thanks for joining us today. Would you mind introducing yourself and then start by telling us a little bit about how you arrive at or depart from theory in your research and or teaching?
Yeah, it's great to be here with y'all. It was fun to be a part of the project. So, huge props to both of you for getting together a pretty amazing squad. Um, so I'm Ryan Oto. I am an assistant professor at the University of Minnesota. I think part of my story that I want to share is my research and this chapter are really grounded in my experiences in K-12 contexts. Specifically, I was a social studies teacher in high schools and middle schools for 13 years and doing teacher leadership. Um, but a lot of the work that I do now is and did when I was a teacher too were like well beyond the classroom. And so I think when I think about kind of like where theory was a really grounding part of that kind of interlocking aspect of like how I think and how I exist in the world was it gave me language to make sense of what I was experiencing, what I was trying to accomplish. Um, that language to some degree was helpful in making things legible to other people. And in other ways, it's unapologetically illegible. And I think that that was a really fun experience, particularly in working at this kind of like intersection of like where young people and adults are trying to problem solve and how that creates moments of opportunity for things like solidarity, but also how it created really productive tensions and how that created that then ultimately led to clarity around like how power works in schools and how we can take people to some degree at their word, but really we have to trust ourselves and lead through the actions that they demonstrate to us and what that ultimately meant. So I think that was kind of the departure, right? Like theory got us to the place of like we can make sense of what we're seeing and feeling and what we're doing. Um, and then when it came to like how do we want to change our community, it wasn't that theory was unhelpful. It was that these young folks, when it came to like school change, already had answers. And so theory was just reinforcing things they already knew. And that was cool in some ways. It was like, oh, there's this cool way we think about that from like Paulo Freire. And they're like, yeah, we don't care. That sounds cool. But like, we're here to like make it so that our day doesn't suck so much. Um, and so that was kind of where then theory kind of for me as like an educator, a scholar, and like a community member, it was like, oh, okay, I can let go of this. Again, not because it was unhelpful, but because the work kind of just led to something else.
Wow, thank you so much for that great response. And it's so many interesting inroads into the conversation about why this particular theory, which is a great segue into our next question. Can you speak a little more about why solidarity and why youth enterprise?
Yeah. So in kind of preparing for this, I was trying to answer that question in an elevator pitch. And I think part of it is like if I'm giving you an elevator pitch, if I'm trying to convince you of like why solidarity, I'll start there. Is like solidarity is like a really popular term, I think. People love talking about it. Um, it's a really accessible term. And in that, there are a lot of complicated things that come with it. Specifically, that people like to use solidarity in a popular form as like a normative thing. Like we should be in solidarity with. Um, And they also like to use it in a descriptive form of like, oh, this is an example of solidarity when blank, blank, blank happens. And the tension between something that can exist both normatively and descriptively is something that uh, I like to wrestle. And so I draw from like kind of like critical Black intellectuals who say like normative approaches to theory have actually been really harmful historically. Thinking about someone like Charles Mills, who's saying, liberal political theory is great and all, and has been implicated pretty clearly in racial oppression historically. So we need to actually take more of a historical materialist approach to this. So when I think about solidarity, I was kind of approaching it from the same way, and specifically kind of looking at, and here's my elevator pitch of like, we want to do anti-oppressive work in schools. There's only a handful of adults that I found who are like, I don't really care about anti-oppressive work in schools, um, which this isn't really about them or for them. But for those of folks who are really curious, they oftentimes I find myself in conversations where they say, "Well, how do I do that?" And I know I'm not alone in this, but it really led me to ask this question of like, what does it actually mean to do anti-oppressive work with young people? And really focusing on the width in that question. I think a lot of the ways that I think of anti-oppressive teaching are really situated in for, like I'm teaching for students in a particular type of way. I'm going to introduce them to these things, these curricular kind of like representations, or these kind of pedagogical moves because it's for them within the context of a classroom that I control the conditions of. And so leaning into the kind of the width of that meant I had to understand solidarity at a pretty intimate level. And what I write about, I draw on Ruben Gatsambide Fernandez's kind of approach to solidarity through what he calls a pedagogy of solidarity. And he has three modes of that. And he says that it's relational, it's transitive, and it's creative. Um, and he kind of gets at, and I think really, really spoke to me in kind of my practitioner world was solidarity so much gets described as like what we do externally or how we can act externally or how we can describe things externally and and solidarity also has to start internally. Like if we're not willing to remake our sense of self, then can we really describe ourselves as being in solidarity or acting in solidarse kind of like transitive ways with people? And so when I thought about the relationships between youth and adults, I was like, a lot of the joy that I got from teaching and that I get from working with young people is because I feel like I get to be my best self. And I didn't really encounter that version of myself until I was in community and in relationships that were really kind of like action oriented, justice oriented um, with young folks. So that was kind of the pull of solidarity for me. I think that youth enterprise offers, and this is a concept that I'm borrowing from Jay Gillen and like a whole slew of really amazing youth organizers that work with youth to try to sustain youth political action in kind of like educational contexts. And I think what youth enterprise does really effectively is it says, why would we pay other people to solve problems that young people are really well positioned to solve? Why would we ask adults to try to like disrupt this system that we have so much investment in if we're thinking about schools and schooling um, when young people are the ones that are constantly coming into conflict with the harms of school and school? Doesn't that then position them to actually be the best problem solvers of those things? And so youth enterprise kind of takes that conceptual approach and then aligns it with a material commitment of we're going to pay young people to honor um, their intellectual skills as knowledge producers, as community supports through tutoring or mentorship or whatever it may be. And we're going to create what Jay calls, and this is borrowing from his work with Bob Moses and Ella Baker, parallel institutions. And if schools aren't going to serve young folks the way that they need to be served, then we're going to create a parallel institution that does that. And he gives the example of math tutoring. For me, it's really around youth participatory action research, or YPAR. But there are examples of youth enterprise all over the world that live in these kind of like what feel like mundane places of like mentoring or tutoring, college readiness, SAT, ACT prep. But something really beautiful happens when basically the conditions are set up where young people are working and supporting each other. That if we really dig into it, it's not so much this kind of like this sort of decorative kind of appeal of like, oh, look, like we have young people like doing our tutoring for us. Look at how like woke we are as a school community. It's more of like what happens in the spaces where adults aren't. And I think that that's a really exciting question, and I like to wrestle with that. So I think youth enterprise really helps kind of get at
Yeah, those are such exciting concepts, and I like the idea of thinking about honoring that knowledge that youth have, their labor and their enthusiasm. So um, thank you so much. Also love the idea of youth as theorizers, which you talked about earlier. So got one more question for you. As the book is inspired around Deleuze's suggestion of being on the lookout, what are some ways that theory reveals itself in your own life outside of the classroom or in spaces where you conduct research?
that. I've been I've been reading a lot of Gramsci, kind of on accident, which I think is a really like fun way to get into Gramsci. And I think one of the things that I'm kind of like taking away, and I think that this aligns with solidarity. Part of it is like I'm reading him because I want to know more about kind of the applied concepts of solidarity. Um, is he talks about like everybody's an intellectual, everybody's a philosopher, and he means that not in this kind of like whimsical intellectual way of like, oh, like we all have something to offer the world, like the more you know. It's more like that has political purpose. And I think when I literally like anytime I enter a school, I was just at a local high school this past week, and um walking through the hallways and just kind of like eavesdropping on conversations that young people were having with each other, trying to navigate what feel like perhaps like not that important of like issues around like, oh my gosh, lunch is so trash today, or oh my gosh, like did you hear so and so said this about someone? um those are still like political issues because they're about examining and understanding how power is taking shape in their lives, and they are constantly theorizing the ways to make sense of their world and the ways in which the world can actually be a better place for them. I think seeing those moments and getting an opportunity to kind of like live in those moments, I am constantly finding myself in such joy of like if we could figure out as adults how to listen to that and how to hear that with a deep sincerity and an understanding of like solidarity, then perhaps there are ways of understanding the world that we have yet to fully realize or we lost along the way to becoming adults, right? So I think that's how it shows up in my life outside of academia.
Wow, thank you for all that great thinking. We greatly appreciate it. And thank you for your wonderful contribution to the project and for being so generous with your time. We hope viewers and listeners today will seek out the book in order to think more about and I love how you said this, the productive tensions and joyful opportunities relating to pedagogies of solidarity and the concept of youth enterprise. We strongly encourage everyone to check out Ryan's highly generative scholarship, which has appeared recently in journals such as Taboo and Theory and Research in Social Education.
Thank you for joining us. Until we chat again.
Bye.